A pardon in the United States is an expression of forgiveness which gives back certain disabled rights, such as the right to vote, serve on jury, or hold public office, and lessens sentences to those who convict federal crimes against the United States. As time went on after the power was officially given in the U.S. Constitution, there have been various instances where the power was used in controversial and possibly abusive ways, some evoking mistrust in the U.S. government by American communities, while others gathered support for reversing historical injustices. The president's right to pardon enables their ability to serve justice to those who have been subjected to excessive punishment, which appoints them the legal duty to appropriately exercise such a powerful and influential right without abusive intentions.
In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation.
Now therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
Crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining.
Dating back to 7th century England, the medieval era in Europe, there lived King Ine of Wessex, who had been one of the first to utilize his power to pardon, or the prerogative of mercy, as they labeled it. Eventually, the concept of authoritative figures granting pardons to criminals reached the new coming nation of the 18th century, the 13 United States of America. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, held at the Independence Hall of Philadelphia, a delegate of New York named Alexander Hamilton first introduced the right to pardon in America. Several debates were held at the convention on whether Congress would be able to exercise the right to pardon convicted criminals, but it ended up being given to only the president. Ratified on June 21, 1788, the president's right to grant pardons was officially established in Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, as it states, "And he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment." Hamilton implied the true purpose of the power to pardon by arguing that in times of distress during insurrection, a well-timed offer of a pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth, and without this right, justice would wear a countenance too sanguinary and cruel. In other words, pardoning and offering grace to those who have rebelled at the right times, such as times of conflict and disaster, can restore a sense of peace in society and reverse injustices. But to what extent has the historical application of the pardon power upheld its intended purpose? And what impact has the exercise of the pardon power had on public confidence in America's leadership and government? As advised by Hamilton to do so, some presidents have pardoned convicted criminals to restore peace after wartime, such as President Jimmy Carter's pardon of those who illegally avoided the Vietnam War draft by fleeing the country, which healed tensions with the thousands who fled. In addition, pardons can correct historical injustices. For example, President Barack Obama pardoned dozens of nonviolent drug offenders that may have been targeted as racial minority groups.
But the overwhelming majority had been sentenced to at least 20 years. 14 of them had been sentenced to life for nonviolent drug offenses. So their punishments didn't fit the crime. At its heart, America is a nation of second chances.
When a president exercises their right to pardon, they have the opportunity to fulfill their legal responsibility, which is to bring justice to society by reversing wrongful convictions in history, and they can bring peace to society after distressing times, as seen in the examples with Presidents Obama and Carter, respectively. Pardons can also have a very negative effect on American society, that being the undermining of public trust in our government. The way some of our presidents have exercised their right to pardon shows signs of abuse by excusing wrongful actions. One example would be when President Trump pardoned Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who was convicted of contempt of court, for going against a judge's order to stop detaining people, specifically Latinos, based off of the suspicion over their immigration legality, without legitimate evidence that a state law has been broken.
Was Sheriff Joe convicted for doing his job? That's what.
Many immigration communities had felt anger towards the pardon since it had served as a lenient act to a figurehead that had threatened their community frequently.
By pardoning Arpaio, Trump tells us that he stands with racists, that he stands with white supremacists, that he stands with violation of our civil rights.
Another example is when Hunter Biden faced various allegations involving tax evasion and questionable business dealings. His father, President Biden, had pardoned him, but many viewed it as nepotism, which is an example of a potentially abusive intention. Although opinions may vary on the situation, it is evident that members of society will question and mistrust our government when the right to pardon is used in potentially wrongful ways. Out of all times the right to pardon was exercised, the most impactful and controversial of them all was President Ford's granting of a pardon for Richard Nixon for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. The Watergate scandal, which led to President Richard Nixon's resignation, was a significant event in American history that caused many to lose faith in the government, led to campaign finance reform, and drove Americans to demand greater transparency in politics. On June 17, 1972, 5 burglars linked to Nixon's re-election campaign for the election of 1972 were arrested at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Despite initial denials, it was revealed that they had stolen documents and planted listening devices. Nixon's administration attempted to cover up the crime by destroying evidence and ordering the FBI to limit its investigation. The scandal was exposed through the work of Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who, with the help of an anonymous source known as the Deep Throat, revealed the extent of Nixon's involvement. The Nixon tapes, recordings of conversations made by Nixon himself, confirmed his direct involvement in the cover-up.
And the films had pictures of Democratic National Committee letterhead documents, so there's things like that are filtering in.
On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in United States v. Nixon that President Nixon had to hand over the Nixon tapes, which confirmed his direct involvement in covering up the White House's role in the burglary. The series of events involving the Watergate scandal faced public opposition and anger, especially because the break-in of the Democratic headquarters was a corruptive tactic of Nixon to get ahead of the 1972 election by gaining access to the Democratic nominees' information. Due to the additional overwhelming threats of impeachment or the trial to be removed from office, President Nixon resigned his presidency on August 8, 1974. The scandal had lasting impacts, including legislative measures aimed at increasing transparency and reforming campaign finance, reshaping the cultural and political landscape of the United States for decades. For example, in order to increase transparency between the American people and the government, procedures were established under the Freedom of Information Act for public access to previously withheld government records. On September 8, 1974, President Gerald R. Ford had granted a full pardon to former President Richard Nixon, which thus made him immune to any arrests, investigation, and imprisonment for his involvement in the Watergate incident. The reasoning behind this pardon was to help rebuild trust in the executive branch and to refocus the public on other topics, such as the approaching Vietnam War. In addition, Nixon was suffering pneumonia at the time, and he believed that the Watergate stressors had worsened his well-being. Mass groups were infuriated by this pardon, and some were confident that there was a secret deal between Nixon and Ford in exchange for Ford's vice presidential position during the 1972 election. President Ford put the pardon ahead of the interests of his own political career, which ultimately led to his defeat in the presidential election of 1976. The most important impact that Gerald Ford's exercise of the right to pardon is the effect it had on society. America strives for a democracy represented by the people, and the president represents the millions of voters and the millions of interests spread across the nation. The right to pardon is significantly unique, and with the specialized right in their hands, the intentions they have, whether abusive or good-willed, will heavily impact the trust our society has in our government. Although the intentions of pardons is of course debatable amongst society, almost all pardons will have an impact on the trust our Americans have in the government. The right to pardon is incredibly powerful and can be used in an efficient way to bring justice to society and to restore peace and tranquility after difficult times that our country has and may continue to face in the future.